1950s film science fiction is what is largely responsible for the frequent comment of B-movie for practically any science fiction film. The reason is because so many of the B-movies of the time were science fiction. To reiterate from my previous reviews, double features were common at this time, so a major picture would be partnered with a low-budget flick that would run afterwards, the second being called the B-picture. They were often made cheap and looked at, and their titles said it all. Creature with the Atomic Brain, I Married a Monster from Outer Space, The Astounding She-Monster. And those are just the ones worthy of their own Wikipedia entry. But the same way that simply having a monster, or flying saucers, or space opera doesn't make a film a B-movie, so too were not all science fiction films in the 50s B-movies. Some of them were intended to be big-budget spectacles. In fact, every major studio had at least one of these full-color science fiction works intended to really do the genre justice. For Paramount, it was The War of the Worlds. For Universal, it was This Island Earth. For 20th Century Fox, it was Journey to the Center of the Earth. And for MGM, it was Forbidden Planet. While War of the Worlds, the first of these films, reached screens years before Forbidden Planet, work began on the latter even earlier than that. In 1952, Irving Bloch and Alan Adler began working on a script called Fatal Planet, which sought inspiration in the work of William Shakespeare, specifically The Tempest. Much is made of this, but it should be noted that, while The Tempest served as a starting point for ideas for Forbidden Planet, it is most definitely not The Tempest in space. There are lots of things that differ wildly in both action and even in theme. For instance, Prospero's wisdom is a virtue, whereas in Forbidden Planet, intelligence is ultimately considered dangerous. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. Point is that Forbidden Planet may have some vestigial traces of The Tempest in it that can be found, certainly, but it definitely went its own way, which overall is a good thing. In Bloch and Adler's original version, the trip was to the planet Mercury, but during the rewrite by Cyril Hume, that, along with other details, changed, such as Adams going from the name of the scientist to that of the dashing commander. This was near the end of Hume's long screenwriting career. And if you'd like another sign of how underappreciated writers are in Hollywood, Hume's Wikipedia entry has fewer words than the section of Shaggy's page that addresses whether or not he's a pot smoker. And if that sounds bad, Fred M. Wilcox, who was brought in to direct, has a 2-sentence page. Wilcox didn't have a science fiction background at all. He was primarily known for doing things like Lassie and The Secret Garden. But the intent was to avoid any B-movie sense to this very expensive, for its time, space exploration story. Wilcox likewise emphasized to everyone involved that they were making a serious picture, and worked to give the film a sense of both realism and the alien. Wilcox's success on this film was his last, actually. After this, he went off to direct independent films, the controversial I Passed for White, which wound up being his last before his early death. But that project did partner him with what neither would have known would be a name that would be forever linked with science fiction films. John Williams did the score. Speaking of music, let's get back to Forbidden Planet. They needed a variety of otherworldly sounds to use in this film, something more than what people were used to. So they hired husband and wife team Louis and Bibi Baron, who were pioneers in electronic music. Their first effort in the field was Heavenly Menagerie, and it was the first created for magnetic tape. They were, in fact, inventing a lot of the devices needed to make their sounds, and it was a painstaking process to do, not helped by the fact that many of their sounds were created by components malfunctioning and wearing out, so they couldn't be duplicated. While Hollywood was using things like the theremin for this purpose, the Barons' material was something that none of them had heard. The couple had already contributed their work to 3 short experimental films, but when their sound effects were heard for Forbidden Planet, it went over so well that they were hired on to replace Harry Partch for the entire soundtrack. And that was no mean feat considering that he was a leading experimental musician in his own right. But the couple's work was a huge contribution in establishing the alien atmosphere of Forbidden Planet, Sadly, this did not sit well with the musicians' union, and in one of those typical Hollywood pissing contests, the Barons were denied admission to the union, and the producers were forbidden to refer to what they did as music, crediting it instead as electronic tonalities. Another victory for lawyers. To further enhance the atmosphere and verisimilitude of the work was the effort put in by the special effects and art departments. Hollywood legend Cedric Gibbons, one of the founders of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, was in charge, but he gave a great deal of freedom to Arthur Lonergan to create a truly alien epic look to the film. Advice was taken from Caltech on everything from what the vehicles would be like to what color to make the sky. But what really helped save the movie was a have-your-cake-and-eat-it-too approach to the monster. The monster would be invisible, to add to the terror of it, but to avoid looking too cheap to have a monster, and, feeling cheated that they never got the chance to see it, they had a way of showing enough of it via effects in order to terrify the audience. Effects animation would be needed for that, except MGM didn't have one of those. But they were able to convince Disney to allow one of theirs to work on Forbidden Planet. Joshua Mador, who had handled animated works for them such as Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan, live-action works like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and the most well-known sequence of Fantasia, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, came on board, and his work on both the effects and on the monster were astonishing. And combined with the sounds of the Barons, pants-crappingly scary for the 50s, and even still chilling today. Of course, the most notable part of Forbidden Planet beyond the science fiction elements is the unexpected leading man. When Jim Abrahams, along with partners David and Jerry Zucker, worked to create their classic film Airplane, which, like Forbidden Planet, had been preserved in the National Film Archive for cultural significance, they looked for serious dramatic leading men to play serious dramatic roles in a silly picture to make things that much more ridiculous. But it's why, for the last 35 years, Leslie Nielsen is known for comedy. Yet the same reason this rebounded his career into comedy is why he was brought on to Forbidden Planet. Nielsen played the role of spaceman with straight-laced seriousness. He wasn't stiff, and there is more emotion to his performance than you see in his later comedy roles, but as he approaches it with the same gravitas that any actor would to any serious leading man role, you believed it. It just happened to be in a science fiction film this time. But while Nielsen is the most famous face for us today, in the 50s that went to the top-billed Walter Pidgeon, who played the scientist Morbius. Pidgeon had returned to the spotlight in the World War II years and rose to such prominence by this time that he even served as president of the Screen Actors Guild. But at the time, the one to most capture the imagination of the public wasn't the humans, it was Robbie the Robot. Robbie was created specifically for Forbidden Planet. Compared to the robots of the period, which were basically just stacked boxes with limbs, Robbie the Robot looked far more real, with components visible that implied functionality. Robbie was designed by Robert Kinoshita, whose work was previously designing washing machines, believe it or not. Robbie the Robot was a quite expensive prop, and so was reused in Cyril Hume's next film, The Invisible Boy, and would go on to appear further in shows ranging from The Twilight Zone to Mork and Mindy to Columbo, and even served as the basis for the Protectron-style robot in the video game series Fallout. Robbie even appeared on Lost in Space, which featured its famous robot, which was also designed by Kinoshita. Robbie the Robot's voice was provided by Marvin Miller, an experienced voice actor who would eventually serve as the narrator of Police Squad, a short-lived spoof of cop shows by the same Abraham Zucker's team of Airplane, and starred Leslie Nielsen. Not the reunion that you would have expected, to be sure. And perhaps the weirdest presence is one of the unnamed members of the spaceship crew, played by James Best, who would be known decades later as the buffoonish Sheriff Roscoe P. Coltrane of The Dukes of Hazzard. The film was a success with both critics and audiences, and would forever leave an impact through one of its fans. Gene Roddenberry admits in his official biography that this film was a strong influence on him in making Star Trek, which itself is one of the defining science fiction phenomenons in America. Other works such as Doctor Who, Babylon 5, and The Outer Limits have all had episodes that drew upon an aspect of this film. So let's take a look at it, this special film from the past, Forbidden Planet.